Good morning, everyone. This is Bridget Burns here from WEDO. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm going to unmute Hannah, and maybe you can let me know if you can hear me. Hannah?
Yes, hello.
Perfect, you can hear me. Thank you so much. Can you see my screen as well?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to give it just one more minute to let other people join, and then we will start. Okay, I'm going to get started. Thank you for joining the second session of this two-session series. As with yesterday, we're recording this at the moment, and so yesterday's is already available up on WEDO's YouTube page. At the end of this presentation and a full recording of the audio will also be available on our YouTube page, and we will share both of those recordings out to everyone who has registered and signed up for this series, and also to our broader networks. The intention for today is to give a very brief history of how gender has been included in the UNFCCC climate negotiations. It's a bit more of a technical presentation in terms of where we have seen progress and how gender has actually been integrated in the specific thematic areas, really geared towards those who are prepping themselves to go to COP and to understand better where there are potential entry points. I'm also going to point out some key tools and then share some key events that are happening at the upcoming COP, noting that in the next few days, probably before the end of next week, the Women and Gender constituency will be providing a much more detailed calendar of events. So I've only highlighted some of the broad events that will be happening that you should keep yourself aware of, noting that the dates will come further to that. I have between a half-hour to 40-minute presentation, depending on how long it takes me just to get to show you some of the different pieces. And then I'm going to leave the rest of the time open for questions. I'm assuming there might be some particular questions on the Gender Action Plan and what the next steps are with that. So hopefully I'll leave time for that, and we'll get started right now. So as a background, again, my name is Bridget Burns. I'm the co-director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and also one of the co-focal points, along with my colleague Kalyani, of the Women and Gender constituency. And I have been engaging in the climate change process, specifically looking at gender issues for just about 8 years now, and working with all of our partners in the Women and Gender constituency, which I will come back to at the end of the presentation. So one thing that I think is really important to understand, and some of these slides are the slides that I will use with decision makers, delegates, people who are engaging within the climate change process, is there's still a misunderstanding of what we mean when we talk about gender, and very much a conflation between talking about women and talking about gender as a lens to understand climate change. So we spend a lot of time within the Women and Gender constituency talking about the importance of understanding gender as a lens, as a social construct that intersects with other social relations, of course, age, race, disability, religion, and many others. When we're talking about gender and climate change, gender does not mean women alone. And as an example, we, even in discussing things like the Gender Action Plan, when talking about it with different party delegates, there was a lot of misunderstanding about why, for example, all of the actions weren't specifically targeting women, why they were asking for gendered analysis, or even a simple question as can national gender and climate change focal points, which have been called for, can they be men? Do they have to be women? So there's still this sort of a little bit of a misunderstanding and a hesitancy to thinking about gender as a lens that needs to be applied to all climate policy so that climate policies can be responsive. And of course, part of the reason for this is that that what we see when we look at gendered impacts is that gendered impacts most often disadvantage and disenfranchise women and girls in certain situations. And so we know that when building our action plans and policies and programs, a lot of those programs will specifically put in place policies or actions that enable and empower women to claim their rights. And so it's important as we talk about gender to recognize within the context of climate negotiations and in many spaces that there's still a need to introduce nuance, to introduce understanding, to start from where people are and help them understand why it's important to provide opportunities for women's empowerment, women's leadership, but also how we understand gender as a social construct and a lens. Partly the way that we try to talk about this is by understanding or helping people to think about examining gender and gender differentiated roles, responsibilities, perspectives, by thinking through the different types of roles within any community or society, whether they are reproductive, productive, community managing roles, political roles, seeing the intersections that exist within all of those roles and how that would then affect the kinds of policies that are trying to be developed. One of the things that also comes up a lot in the context of, I know in many of our work, but particularly in the context of climate change too, is a request for evidence. You know, where's the data that substantiates the differentiated impact between women and men on, you know, in terms of gender roles? And so there's the answer to that is that there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of information out there that's being collected. And there's many different groups that have been trying to put these into really bite-sized fact sheets, toolkits for different regions and different countries to be able to really strengthen the case that they're making to people who might not be as familiar with why gender is so important to understanding climate action. One of these tools, the Global Gender and Climate Alliance, or the GGCA, in 2016 delivered a report on gender and climate change, a closer look at existing evidence. A closer look at existing evidence. This is a, I think, 90-page report which has been slimmed down into several different fact sheets. It contains hundreds of examples of how gender roles intersect with climate impacts. I've listed a few here, but I really recommend that report if you're trying to pull out some key statistics and facts that will help really to make your case in a particular region or in relation to a particular subject matter. You also have the tome, I'll call it. It's an 800-page, I think, report that was done by the by AUCN, including a lot of contributions from the members of the GGCA and the Women and Gender constituency, which looks at energy, adaptation, mitigation, and so the evidence is there. The data is there to really substantiate and back up this information. It's not enough, and one of the things we continue to ask for is for stronger and more detailed sex and gender analysis and disaggregated data. So one of the things, as I mentioned before, when talking about gender in the context of the UNFCCC, you see that there's two ways in which this has been integrated and considered in the actual negotiations themselves. There is a lot of focus on enhancing women's leadership and gender balance in the actual decision-making process on national delegations as well as in boards and bodies. When I go through the key moments where gender has been integrated, you'll see that this was the first starting point of understanding gender in the context of the UNFCCC. And given, unfortunately, that there's been very, very slow progress, even with decisions that have been made, and very striking imbalance in terms of the boards and bodies in particular, it continues to be a focus of the negotiations. But there's also a number of thematic areas where gender is being considered in terms of policy development programming in a more transformative and normative way. So these are just some of the stats in terms of women's participation. Since 2008, on average, female delegates made up 30 to 36% of party delegations, and it reached a peak in 2014 at 36%, but unfortunately in 2016, that overall participation fell back to 32%. Regionally, this is very diverse, so that 36% is a total number, but we see in different regions that some have been increasing in women's participation, but there's more gender balanced delegations, for example, in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, than there is in the Asia Pacific and African countries. And then when you look at the different advisory boards, for example, on technology, the CDM, the Green Climate Fund, the Least Developed Countries Expert Group, they all have less than 1/5 members who are women. The GCF in particular, it's one of the newer bodies, so you would think that, especially because from its inception it had as a goal gender balance on the board, that it might have a better reflection of women in its body, but it does not. It's one of the worst of the bodies, actually. And as we have here, at the current pace of progress, gender balance under the UNFCCC will not be achieved until 2040. This is, it goes back to when we look at how many different times the mandate for enhancing gender balance has been considered, the fact that there's not progress being made. I've always seen gender balance as a symptom of deeper gender inequality, of course, that exists, not at just an international level, but that clearly exists at an institutional level and at a state and a national, local level as well, in terms of where there's opportunities and who's given those opportunities. So it's something to take into account as we look at the other aspects of the policy considerations that have been made. So this is my brief snapshot that we put together of where we've seen gender being considered in the UNFCCC. Sorry, I have to get better at that acronym. You'd think I'd be able to say it by now. And again, this is a bit technical, so it goes through every single COP where something major has happened around gender. And the way that I'm going to go through it is first look at what I would say are standalone gender decisions, so decisions that only focus on either enhancing gender responsive policy or gender balance. And then I will go back and look how gender has actually been considered through the other thematic areas of the negotiations. So the first decision on gender in relation to the UNFCCC actually happened at COP7 with decision 36CP7. This was in Marrakesh in 2001. It focused only on the participation and representation of women. Again, there was no real requirements put into this decision. It invited parties to give active consideration to the nomination of women. It requested that the Secretariat highlight this decision, so whenever the Secretariat put out calls for nominations, it highlighted that this decision had been made, and it asked the Secretariat to start maintaining the information on the gender composition just of the UNFCCC bodies, so not of the delegations themselves. And I have to fix this slide, I keep forgetting to do it, but in follow-up to this, not 5 years later, because this was COP18, and so that was more than 11 years later, with very slow progress on enhancing women's participation. There were a number of groups and parties who felt that it was important to come back and improve and reaffirm that decision that had been taken in the original COP7. And so decision 23CP18, people talk a lot about Doha as being this important moment for gender because of this decision. It was a reaffirmation of this earlier decision, but there were some key things that were different about this decision, which has opened up the space to a much more significant work on gender now. And one of those is that it added gender and climate change as a standing item on the agenda of the COP, which gives it a formal space to be discussed, and it's something that's really important as an advocate or even as a party who's working towards certain issues to have a space on the agenda to discuss those issues. It set an actual goal of gender balance and with a timeline as gradual but significant increase. And there was a lot of debate about this in COP18 about whether we could set a quota, should there be a more clear timeline, and what happens at the review. And there was a review at COP22, and as I shared, gender balance did peak and fall backwards, so obviously it's not a gradual but significant increase. And a lot of the pieces that have been put in place, as well as the impetus for the Gender Action Plan, is the hope that there will be activities which will actually start and support the implementation of meeting this goal. The follow-up from COP18 was COP20 Decision 18 CP20, where you had the Lima Work Program on Gender developed. So if you start to see what you have here is, and you'll see this more when I go through the other areas of the negotiations where there's been progress, but you had this firm attention to enhancing gender balance and women's leadership. At the same time, there was progress being made across the other areas of the negotiation, adaptation, technology, etc., to integrate gender into data collection, into analysis, and decision making, policy making. And so it was felt that the current decisions on gender didn't really go far enough to move beyond gender balance to considering gender responsive climate policy. There was a lot of work by different parties and different constituencies, the women and gender constituency, to frame and form what was then the Lima Work Program on Gender, which enhanced the earlier decisions on gender balance, but also included a focus on the implementation of gender responsive climate policy. And so this actually gave a number of mandates to the Secretariat and as well as to parties related to setting up a focal point on gender at the UNFCCC Secretariat, to having them do reviews of implementing gender-related mandates, to enhance training and awareness for delegates on gender-responsive climate policy, reaffirm training and capacity building for women delegates. It established the first 2 in-session workshops that we had on gender to further understanding of gender in relation to mitigation, technology, adaptation. It called for submissions from parties on all of these pieces, and it also called for a technical paper by the Secretariat on guidelines for implementing these gender considerations, which is available online, and I can share that with you as well. So you'll see this is a huge jump from the earlier decisions to make it much more inclusive, much more comprehensive of a broader understanding of gender within the context of climate policy. And then finally, in Marrakesh at COP22, you had a review of the progress and the actions and activities that took place under the Lima Work Program, which included those technical papers and workshops, and there was a decision by parties to extend the work of the Lima Work Program on gender for 3 years to be reviewed at COP25 in 2019. And it also established itself a number of new activities. So even before we get to where we are now with the Gender Action Plan, there are a number of actions that have been called for under the extension of the Lima Work Program. And that includes things from enhancing communications and reporting by the technical bodies, the financial mechanism, for example, on how they're implementing gender responsive climate policy, the mandates that they have. It requested gender perspectives to be considered in the organization of technical expert meetings. So there's technical expert meetings being held on mitigation and adaptation, and so this requests that this be included. Of course, the requests need to be followed up with the support to actually implement those requests. One important piece, and it really links to something else that's happening at COP23 this year, which is very important, which is requesting parties to integrate local and traditional knowledge in the formulation of climate policy and recognizing the value of the participation of grassroots women in gender-responsive climate policy. So you'll see when we look at the gap, the Gender Action Plan, and some of the activities that have been formulated now, a lot of them speak to this piece as well. And this links to the new local communities and indigenous peoples platform that's being developed under the SUBSTA and should be adopted at COP23. So I think there's a lot of potential to even build on that more. And one of the two other ones that I think are really important to note, it invited parties to appoint and provide support for a national gender focal point for the climate negotiations, for implementation and for monitoring, and I'll come back to that at the end on how that is being done. And then finally, it mandated parties to develop possible elements of a gender action plan for consideration at the upcoming COP23. So this is, in terms of the standalone gender agenda items, this is where we are now and what we've worked towards, and we're left with the possible elements of a gender action plan, which I'm going to get into. I'm just going to quickly go through the meanwhile and sort of why gender has such a broad consideration under the UNFCCC, but why coherence and a focus on implementation is so important, because it has been considered under a number of different areas, but we need to be able to monitor and support and implement those in a much more comprehensive way. So while gender has had that recognition across those standalone decisions, there's also been a lot of work to integrate gender across all the areas of the negotiations, starting with Decision 1 CP16, which was one of the main decisions coming out of the first session after Copenhagen, so in Cancun. And I will say the intention and a lot of the work that had gone into this language was intended to be in the original global decision that was supposed to be taken at COP15. And so a lot of that language wasn't lost. It was taken into the outcomes of the following two meetings, COP16 and COP17. And there's a shared vision that lays out the decisions of COP16, which says and recognizes gender equality and the effective participation of women as critical and important for climate action and all aspects of climate change. This is really important because as activists and advocates in the process, knowing what the language is that has been used has become really critical for us to integrate language into the rest of the decisions. Decision 1 CP16 is really important because it talks about gender equality, and you might know that in some of the discussions there's been some contention over using the terminology of gender equality, and so it's very important to recognize it is already agreed language in the context of the convention. So under adaptation, it's one of the areas where gender is most well integrated across 16 different decisions, and I've just listed here some of the key decisions, including that original, where the original first decision on COP7, at COP7 on gender balance was made. It also was the COP where the preparation of, it stated that the preparation of NAPAs, or National Adaptation Plans of Actions, must be guided by gender equality. And you'll see one of the key aspects of Decision 1 CP16, which laid out how adaptation should be done in terms of country-driven approach. It said that adaptation should also be gender sensitive. And that affirmation has really allowed all of the subsequent decisions on gender to go back to that original agreed language where gender, that said adaptation should be gender sensitive, and now in the Paris Agreement states that it should be gender responsive. I'm just going to skip this, but this is here again. These slides are all here for you. I've put these in as examples around adaptation and gender. There's another one on mitigation, just to give people more context of what that actually looks like. Mitigation is one of the areas where gender is unfortunately least considered, partly because gender within the context of climate change is still very much understood as an aspect of vulnerability, of how you can assess vulnerability, as opposed to from a human rights-based perspective, potentially in terms of beneficiaries and in terms of having rights of participation and representation. So this is an area where a lot more work needs to be done, and a lot of focus is being paid by different parties and activists. But there are some decisions where gender has been included, or language on women has been included. One that I will note, for example, is in Decision 2 CP17 on response measures, which is becoming an increasingly important area to talk about just transition and decent work. There is language about considering the positive and negative impacts on women and children. So again, these are all places where we see entry points that are become important for our broader gender agendas. On technology transfer and development, one of the critical decisions under technology, although again this is an area where, like mitigation, there's less understanding, but in the development of the Climate Technology Center Network, it was affirmed that in its mission that it should take gender considerations into account, and that has really led to a number of different activities. The CTCN has its own gender page now. They have someone who's a gender focal point. The CTCN is partnering with the Women in Gender constituency at the moment to support highlighting our gender-just climate solutions. So this type of language and these considerations become really important in the long run for setting up some institutional framing for how the implementation should happen. In finance, there's been a number of key decisions that have been taken that have really resulted in where we are with current policies. In decisions 3 CP17, which was at that COP17 in Durban, where in COP16 and COP17 you found all of the work that had been done in the lead up to COP15 coming into fruition through standalone decisions that set up these institutions while we didn't have yet that global agreement. And so in the establishment of the Green Climate Fund, which is the governing instrument, stated that the fund would take a gender-sensitive approach. And for many of you who follow the Green Climate Fund, you'll know that this language has resulted in a number of different decisions, including a gender policy plan that the Green Climate Fund has. There's mandates in terms of accredited entities having gender policies, in terms of projects needing to include gender to be considered, and all coming and really stemming from this language and the original mission of the fund and the establishment of the fund. And further decisions we've seen in the reviewing of the financial mechanism, parties calling for gender-sensitive approaches to be clearly articulated in their reporting and reviewing. And then on capacity building, gender is well considered under capacity building, and a lot of this stems again from that first COP16 decision, the post-Copenhagen decision, which defined capacity building in a way that should always take into account gender aspects, and it's meant that it's been pretty well understood that gender should be considered in all aspects of capacity building. And then finally, on loss and damage, there's been 2 decisions on loss and damage where there's been a strong recognition of the need for strengthening as well as collecting and disseminating sex and gender disaggregated data. So when we came time to the Paris Agreement, a lot of these decisions that have been taken previously, including the standalone decisions on gender, were used in the advocacy towards having gender equality and women's rights mainstreamed through the Paris Agreement. We had started in the beginning of the year with having language on gender across all of the different thematic areas. Unfortunately, gender was not kept in the thematic areas on technology or finance, which again, it's odd because of course we have this quite strong mandate for gender considerations in finance, for example, and it's clear in the CTCN, but it wasn't taken up in the finance section of the Paris Agreement. It is, however, recognized in the preamble, which we have this very strong paragraph in the preamble that many constituencies fought for around the obligations on human rights, the rights of indigenous peoples, gender equality. There's also other parts of the preamble that talk about just transition, and gender was recognized again in adaptation and capacity building. As I said before, most likely easier and more well understood in these areas, partly because of the way gender is understood, but also because they have these strong mandates from COP16, which defined both adaptation and capacity building as needing to include gender considerations. On NDCs, there's been a lot of analysis of different NDCs and whether or not they include references to women or gender. 64 of the 190 NDCs analyzed do include that, and what everyone has noted is that all of those 64 countries are non-Annex 1 countries, which is significant because all of those NDCs really require a significant amount of support, finance, and implementation, support and finance and means in order to be implemented. And also it hones in on the fact that, and this is something that I see shifting personally, that developed countries have for very long not understood gender as a lens to be considered in their own policies, that they should be doing analysis of gender in their own countries and doing these kind of, bringing this as a lens into their own planning and programming as well. So I'm going to move on to the Gender Action Plan now and where we are. I'm just going to take a moment, though, to double check and see if there's any questions. Hannah, sorry, I just saw your request to speak slower. I apologize. I'm trying to just get through what I can, but I assure you that everything will be available online for you to review, and you'll have this slide so that you can go through it as well. And maybe I can slow myself down. I apologize. I always speak a little too fast. And Ida, perhaps we can come back to that at the end. I think that's a potentially really good suggestion. So I'm going to continue going through, and then when I open up, if there are people who have suggestions for advocacy, that is most welcome. So just on these last few slides, where we are now, the UNFCCC, of course, has moved into this phase of implementation for climate action. We are looking at implementation of the Paris Agreement, and the intention, I believe, of parties and those who work to push for the action plan was that it wasn't enough anymore to have these mandates or wishes about requests for parties to do things around gender, but really give a clear action plan with defined activities which will actually help us reach the goal of those mandates. So the specific mandate of the GAP states that its objective is to support the implementation of gender-related decisions and mandates under the UNFCCC process, which may include key results areas, key activities and indicators, timelines for implementation, the responsible and key actors and indicative resource requirements for each activity, and further elaborate its process of review and monitoring. So it is actually a pretty clearly defined objective in terms of what its goal is to do, which is supporting the implementation of gender-related decisions and mandates, and that's an important piece. It's something that's come up a lot in the different consultations that have happened. How do you define whether or not a current or a listed activity under the Gender Action Plan goes beyond or creates a new mandate? And that's been a bit difficult because if you look at a mandate, for example, as all capacity building being gender responsive, that is a very broad mandate. And so it's hard to assess in a way what goes beyond a mandate or what is an activity to achieve a mandate. And because most of the activities being proposed do require financial resources, one of the things that has been tricky is to get parties to commit to activities that will require financial resources. And we'll come back to that in the end because a major barrier to the implementation of this is that this entire agenda is quite under-resourced. So this is a brief overview of what has happened since COP22, which requested the development of a gender action plan to be considered at this upcoming COP. As part of the Lima Work Program decision at COP22, it also requested parties to meet informally to think about the gender action plan, and it requested submissions and an in-session workshop. And so this is the timeline of activities that have happened. In January, parties were requested to share submissions on the views of possible elements of the Gender Action Plan. This might need to be updated. I think there's been one or two more party submissions since this was first calculated at the beginning of the year. But there were 9 party submissions, including the least developed countries and the EU as groups. And then there were 11 non-party submissions, including one from the Women and Gender constituency. And these included multiple options for enhancing work on gender and the elements in the gap. A lot of focus on them, including reporting mechanisms, enhancing coherence. I actually delivered a presentation summarizing some of the key elements of those original submissions for the gender workshop that was held in May, which you can find and access if you want more information on that. Following this call for submissions from the 27th to the 28th of March, the Netherlands, Costa Rica, and UN Women hosted an informal consultation to gather initial ideas on the elements of the gap, and the outcomes of that consultation were submitted by UN Women prior to the May SB session, which, as in the next bullet point, mandated an in-session workshop and it was held from the 10th to the 11th of May. And one of the ways that the submission or the consultation that was held in March was included in that workshop was that the Netherlands presented on behalf of those who were there the outcomes of that report. The report was made available, and the participants in that workshop agreed to work from the initial cluster areas, or sort of result areas that had been defined in the March informals. And really that workshop was a very large brainstorm between parties, civil society observers, who each broke out into different groups and brainstormed the different types of activities that could be included under these 5 different cluster areas, which included coherence among the UNFCCC, within the UNFCCC process and other processes, capacity building and enhancing women's participation, or enhancing gender balance, evaluation and reporting, means of implementation, and one other one, which we'll go through when we go through the report. Finally, following from that report, which I'll pull up for you just so you can see, the Gender Action Plan, or the report of the workshop, included probably around 70 actions that across each cluster had been included. Because the brainstorm was done in different groups took different methods for forming those activities, so there wasn't really a coherence between how they were framed. Some of them were targets and not activities. And so from the 14th to the 15th of September, the Government of Canada hosted, and WEDO administered, a second informal consultation in Ottawa. And parties, what happened in that consultation is parties looked at each activity, as well as looked at each activity and tried to reformulate, question whether or not it created a new mandate, reformulate it into an activity if it seemed like it did, and then come up with a list of potential indicators for the Gender Action Plan. I'm going to actually pull up for you the report of those proceedings, but a lot of the things that have been included are about technical support to gender and women ministries at a national level, capacity building to the constituted bodies of the UNFCCC, coming up with tools or ways for bodies to, or parties to actually enhance gender balance on their delegations. I'll pull up that proceedings report for you, and I'll share it with you so that you can see how that was taken into account. Some of the main challenges that still exist within the Gender Action Plan is, again, that still is a lack of understanding at the national level, in particular, what it means to integrate gender and the technical support to do so. There's a lack of resources at all levels. I mentioned above the activities that are currently under the Lima Work Program on Gender, and those activities are not fully funded yet. So the Gender Action Plan, if it includes anything, that would be additional, an additional commitment of resources. It's going to be quite difficult to have those resources. And we see stalled progress, not just on enhancing gender balance, but we see stalled progress in a lot of the different mandates that we already have on gender. So there's a real need for these actions to actually not create new mandates, but take forward what we have, what we're currently not being able to implement at the moment. And I just want to, I'm actually going to come back to that because I do want to show you the report of the proceedings that came out of COP. Sorry, not of COP, of the consultation. I just need to figure out how to share that with you. I hope that what you see now is a report of proceedings. I will also link this to you it as one of the handouts. This is a report of the last consultation that happened in Canada. It goes over the key documents that were shared prior to this consultation, including one that was done by the Secretariat, which looked at all of the activities that came out of that May consultation and mapped them to current mandates, and put in some notes about whether or not things were new mandates or potentially needed to be reconsidered and set as activities. And so the way this report goes into the way in which the consultation was held over the course of 2 days, and then this is a record of discussion. And as I said before, the way that that this consultation was led was that we looked through each of the activities listed in the May workshop, and a set of questions were asked to the participants. What is the activity? Who's being asked to do it? How? By what time? Does the activity create a new mandate? Is this activity covered by another proposed activity? And so what you'll see and what you'll find as you look through this is that there are a set of proposed reformulations. So if there was, and a lot of these have been clustered together, and if it was felt that the activity that was reformulated is still potentially missing some information to actually make it a concrete action, that was noted, sort of still missing a where and when, for example, this first one. As an example, one of a number of the activities mandated or the activities brainstormed from the in-session workshop were around the collection of sex and gender disaggregated data. One, for example, was creating a community of practice or a community of experts, but it didn't really have a very clear who would do that and what would be the creation. So that was reformulated into the potential activity of creating an online roster of experts on gender and climate change issues for the UNFCCC website, or adding gender as a thematic area to the current roster of experts that exist. So it's trying to take the intention of the activities that were listed in the in-session workshop and make them into more concrete actions for the Gender Action Plan. The other two things that I want to note about this as you look through it, because if you're going to be engaging in the gap discussions, it'll be important to know. You'll see there's a number of activities that were mainstreamed, not mainstream, but that the strike-throughs don't mean that they were disregarded or that they were taken out, but that parties felt that they needed to be reformulated in a different way. So again, some of them are reformulated as activities, but the other ones were reformulated as ideas for workshops. So the Lima Work Program the Lima Work Program decision at COP22 called for 2 further in-session workshops, and it asked parties to define what those workshops would be at COP23. So my assumption is that at COP23, parties will take a decision where in the decision they will outline they will recall the decisions and recall the decisions on gender that have been already taken. They will then look at they'll set it forward a review process for the Gender Action Plan in a decision themselves. They will decide on a number of thematic issues that should be covered in workshops, and then they will either just include the Gender Action Plan or they'll annex the Gender Action Plan to that decision. And so 3 other things were created to try to understand these different activities that were being put forward. One if you go down to the bottom of this report of proceedings, sorry, it's a pretty long report because there were a lot of activities. So a number of the activities that were kind of striked through have been listed now as potential activities or topics identified for considerations as recommendations for the in-session workshops. So again, there's 2 different workshops, and so these are the options that the consultation listed as possible topics for those. There were also so many things listed in the brainstorming that were clearly really important to the to enhancing gender-responsive climate policy, but for many parties it felt like they were clearly beyond mandate of the UNFCCC, but needed to be captured in some way. And so there was some discussion about an idea of the decision including an open call for expressions of interest, and the decision listing a number of activities that should be included in that, to give space for civil society, observers, parties to come together to do planning projects and activities based on a set of activities that have been defined out of this gender action plan. So, and the last one is that some of the activities in the gender action plan call for reporting, call for data to be shared, but it wasn't clear where that would be shared or how it would be articulated to the rest of the community, to the UNFCCC, and to other parties. One thing that's being piloted at this upcoming COP23 at Gender Day is I think it's a 4-hour marketplace or expo where people are going to be invited to showcase the gender-responsive actions and activities that they're doing. And so you'll see a number of the activities in this consultation report actually say that this information should be shared annually at potentially a marketplace or an expo. So that's what this refers to. So this is pretty in-depth into the last consultation that parties had on the gap. What I know is that different parties have different understandings of what they would like to see in the gender action plan, and you'll also see here that the women in gender constituency have a set of key recommendations for what we would like to see in the gender action plan that are really important. We want to make sure that these activities are addressed in some way. And where the process is now is that a certain group of parties who are really engaged in the gender agenda item have, I believe they've requested UN Women to help them develop some sort of more consolidated zero draft as a potential for taking forward the negotiations. Many people have asked what's actually going to happen at COP23. The way that these have happened in the past, and my expectation, given the technical nature of these conversations, is that some party or a group of parties, based on all of these consultations that have happened, will put forward a conference room paper or some sort of draft to be considered by the floor and by the room as the basis of negotiations. It's of course up to the parties in the room if they will accept that. But my understanding is that that is likely what will happen. And so there's a very small window now where it's important to look at these consultations that have happened and engage with parties that are really keen on gender issues, to make sure they're aware of all the consultations that have happened and that they're aware of the status of the current gender action plan discussions, and that they have some key priorities, if they have some key priorities that would like to see included in the gender action plan, that they are part of those conversations early on. So the last thing I wanted to share before opening up to the floor, I'm going to go back to the presentation and share my presentation again. I've mentioned the challenges. I also had mentioned earlier on in the COP22 decision of Lima Work Program, there was this call for national gender and climate change focal points. The incoming Fijian presidency has made this a key aspect of their leadership, is trying to get a huge number of parties to actually nominate national gender and climate change focal points. There is a process for doing so. It's very simple in terms of getting the title, the name, the institution, and the contact details to the gender team, the gender focal point has to be nominated by the UNFCCC focal point, however. So it has to go through the official UNFCCC focal point. And once nominated, you'll be able to see all of these national gender and climate change focal points on a special page on the UNFCCC website, which I've listed here. And then finally, there are two things I just wanted to show you as well. First is the UNFCCC website has a gender and climate change page. Hopefully you can all see this that I'm sharing with you. When you go to the UNFCCC processes page from the beginning, right here on the left-hand side, there's a gender and climate change page. It does not have a lot of the COP23 information up on it yet, but my understanding is it will in the next week, including the key events that are happening. I also wanted to share with you this.
The global community is entering.
Oops. I just messed that up. Well, that seems to be loading, so I'm just going to put the link to this from the YouTube page, but this is a little bit more about the Gender Climate Tracker app, which WEDO has developed, where you can find all of the detailed information on women's participation on each negotiation, on each delegation from 2008 till today in each country. You can also find each country's NDC, as well as a list of those that include gender, and you can look at all of the different thematic areas of the UNFCCC negotiations and find out where gender has been included. So I will share that video in the link box below. Okay. So let's go back to the presentation. Okay. So my last slide is just to share with you the couple of different events that are happening. Gender Day is Tuesday, November 14th. There is as I said before, a marketplace or an expo that's going to be held that day, and more information on the other events happening on Gender Day will be shared in the next couple of days. The Women and Gender constituency will be hosting our our Gender Just Climate Solutions Awards. We'll have a ceremony on the 13th of November, as well as a full exhibition for 2 weeks at the Frauen Museum, which others on the call might want to share more about. There will be a number of side events and a number of press conferences. And then the Women and Gender constituency, each day of the UNFCCC meetings, will host 2 sessions. From 8 to 9, we'll host an advocacy meeting open to civil society, where we discuss strategy and key entry points in the different areas of the negotiations. And then from 9 to 10, and I don't yet know the room, but it will be in the Bond Zone, we will host a daily women's caucus. And we'll have a certain set of thematic days during that daily women's caucus, which will include, but is not limited to, a Pacific Island Women's Day, an Indigenous Women's Day, a Just Transition Day, and a Young Feminist Day. And you can get all of this information, not yet, but soon, in the next few days, at womengenderclimate.org. So now I'm going to, that's it for me, and I'm going to go back over to the questions, as well as check and see if people have anything to add. I see that I'm going to unmute Ida because you had added something, and maybe you can kick us off with questions and comments.
Thank you, Bridget, for a really, really useful presentation. My question was in regard to what you said about women's participation. And I just wanted to ask if WEDO and other partners to the Women and Gender Constituency have been working on the OHS Convention, which is a convention from the UN Economic Commission for Europe, so not for a global constituency. But the OHS Convention calls for ensuring the right to participation and the right for information in regards to environmental sustainability and challenges and whatnot. So I just wanted to ask if you've been working on that, or if you think that we can use that in a global context. At least all the UN Economic Commission for Europe members have signed up to this. So is that something you're working on?
So it's a great contribution, and the OHS Convention actually does come up a lot in the UNFCCC, particularly in relation to the agenda items around participation information and access to information and participation. From the perspective of civil society participation in the UNFCCC negotiations, for example, there are a number of discussions that are closed, and there's only informal modes of working within the UNFCCC, and so there's a feeling that a lot of these sessions are closed arbitrarily, while there's an understanding amongst most of civil society that at some point parties will have to go into a closed meeting. There's an expectation that will only happen at the highest political levels, but where discussions are technical, that there should be a right to participation, and especially there's another group which the Women in Gender Constituency engages in, called the Human Rights Working Group, and within that group we use the OHS Convention a lot in terms of discussions of both the right to participation of civil society, but also enhancing participation of other groups. And it was raised by one or two parties in the discussions of the Gender Action Plan, particularly on how do we ensure the participation of Indigenous and grassroots women. So I think that there's probably even more strategic ways that we could use it in our advocacy, and I don't know exactly what that would be right now, but certainly something I think we should engage with the Human Rights Working Group on to see if there is a space for strengthening the Gender Action Plan or some of the gender work through that.
Thank you so much, Bridget. That's perfect.
And then, Hannah, I'm going to unmute you as well.
Oh, hello.
Hi. Oh, you have a question, Margaret?
No, I didn't have a question, Margaret. I was just answering Nida's question whether or not any of the partners were specifically working on it. But I think you answered quite quickly. So I don't think I have anything to add on that.
Okay. Are there any other questions that people have? I saw a question. Kristen, hi, welcome. I'm glad you were able to join. About whether these documents would be shared, and yes, this entire the entire presentation and audio will be recorded. Or is being recorded and will be uploaded online, and the documents that I have been mentioning throughout, including the reported proceedings, I'm going to upload as handouts to you before the end of the call, or after the call. I think those will still be available to you, and I'll also share them with you. I'm going to be sending an email out to everyone who's participated in the last 2 days with links and with the documents that you haven't had. Are there any other comments or questions about the status of the Gender Action Plan? Or the one other thing I did want to mention, because we've been really, yesterday we focused a lot on the overall agenda for COP23. Today we were talking specifically about that gender agenda item, the standalone gender agenda item, but of course the Women in Gender Constituency work across the entire scope of the negotiations. So I'm just gonna open, these are our key demands from COP22, and we are working on finalizing our key demands right now for COP23, and those should be available. We have our last inputs today, so this should be available next week. But you'll see that the Women and Gender constituency has key demands across the NDCs, the framing of the facilitative dialogue and the global stocktake. We have very strong demands around just transition away from fossil fuels, agriculture, water, health, loss and damage, and so we'll provide you with those key demands as well, so you can see how we're working on and looking at the entire convention. And I think with that, that is all that I had wanted to cover for today, and make sure that people had these resources available to them. If you are going to COP, as I've shared with probably many of you, the Women and Gender constituency will have a strategy meeting on Sunday the day before, where we'll focus on planning our days together for the final 2 weeks. And as soon as we can, we will get all of that information to you on key events, thematic days, and hopefully whether you are there or remotely, you can be either engaged with us in person, or Hannah and some of my other colleagues are working together on a very clear and strong communications plan. So if you cannot support us there, hopefully you can support and engage in the work from wherever you are. So thank you so much for taking the time with us today, with me today, and if there's any other resources that we can provide to make these issues clear, then just let us know. Otherwise, have a great day. Thank you so much. Oh, Titi, did you have a question? I'm really sorry. Oh, she left, so hopefully not. Okay. Thank you, everyone.